A conversation on personal identity and surviving mind uploading with Professor Jeff McMahan. Professor Jeff McMahan is the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Widely known for his work on bioethics, animal ethics, and related studies, he has written extensively about matters of identity, death, killing, the beginning of life, and the end of life. Recommended readings include Cloning, Killing and Identity, Brain Death, Cortical Death and Persistent Vegetative State, and Cognitive Disability and Cognitive Enhancement. According to McMahan, our interest in living depends on our psychological connection to our future selves at a given time. Thank you very much for joining us here. I'm not going to do a long introduction right now because we're going to paste an introduction in front of it anyway. But perhaps it's useful to you if I can say a few things about who we are, our organization, just so that you're aware. The Carbon Copies Foundation, which I'm the founder of, is a research nonprofit that focuses on an interest in building artificial human brains. So basically neural prosthesis taken to the extreme, as it were. And the possibility of doing that not just for a generic blueprint of a human brain, but for a specific human brain. In fiction, that's sometimes called mind uploading, and in a sense, that's what takes place in those teleporter scenarios that you see in science fiction as well. Now, of course, we recognize that this sort of thing is scientifically and technologically incredibly ambitious, and that we don't try to make any predictions about when or even if that's ever going to become a reality. That said, given that there is already work taking place on building neuromimetic prosthesis for regions CA3 and CA1 of the hippocampus and similar work, I can imagine possible paths that would eventually take us there. So we treat it as a topic that has a lot of interesting scientific and technological questions, and we usually just address those problems. So typically, what we talk about are things like data acquisition. How would you record the detailed connectome? Or how would you record high-resolution electrophysiology? Or the modeling problem? But the questions that are often asked are really not even about those things. Some of the most common questions that we get, especially from the lay public, are things like, can you create consciousness in an artificial brain? Or, if your brain is reconstructed, do you survive such an upload in the sense that your personal identity carries on? So we decided that to update the so-called roadmap to whole brain emulation, both of those questions deserved some explicit treatment. And in the preceding part of this series, we talked with a few experts about consciousness, and now the topic is personal identity.
Okay.
Now, typically, what we do is we try to keep our topics as independent as possible so that there isn't a lot of confusion by having to deal with multiple complex questions at the same time. So, for instance, we deal separately with the problem of data acquisition, and then we simply assume, okay, what if we assume that those problems were solved and we could acquire data at an arbitrary degree of precision? Now let's talk about the next problem. And so that's how we then talk about consciousness. And then if we assume that we can create consciousness and that's not a problem, now we try to deal with this idea of, okay, so personal identity and how it could survive a procedure such as that if everything else were given, right?
Okay.
And I think one of the things that we have the hardest time with is that every time when a conversation turns to something like consciousness or personal identity, we begin with everyone being in some different corner when it comes to what they understand as personal identity, or what it means for personal identity to persist, or to survive. And that makes it difficult, that these definitions don't seem to be really precise. And it would be nice if we can help that sort of thinking along in a way to make it a bit more precise. That would be really helpful, actually. That would help us enormously. If we could at least talk about what it's like right now to have personal identity and what that means and how it can persist, even in normal daily circumstances, all the sort of things that happen, even things that perhaps we don't always think about, but that do happen, such as, what if someone has to undergo a procedure whereby all brain activity is stops because they have to do hypothermic surgery. So there is really no brain activity anymore. But then later the activity returns. Is this still the same person? We don't normally think about that. We think, of course, they are. Because I think those kinds of examples of thinking about what that's like today, that helps us think about future scenarios as well. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. But I thought maybe the best place to start then is to get your take on how we're supposed to think about personal identity. And one of the things that has bothered me a lot when I read about it is that it isn't immediately clear to me whether people think of it in binary or graded terms. Because it's very easy to think of identity as identical. And so, yeah, I'd love your take on that. How are we supposed to think about it?
Okay. First thing to say is, in response to your question about whether this is, as you say, binary or graded, I take that to mean, is personal identity all or nothing, or is it a matter of degree? And the answer, I think, is personal identity is all or nothing. Either someone in the future will be me, or that person will not be me. There's an all or nothing answer. And that's because when we use the notion of personal identity in the philosophical literature, what we're talking about really is simply existence. Whether I will continue to exist, when I began to exist, when I will cease to exist. So people are systematically misled by the use of the term identity, because that's a term that has a great many different meanings in ordinary language. And we can say things like, I'm losing my identity. Mm-hmm. And that's not what people have in mind when they're discussing the question of personal identity in the philosophical literature. That question, the question of personal identity, is really what are the conditions of the continued existence of one and the same individual entity. And the question of personal identity includes the question, what are the conditions of my beginning to exist? That is, when did I begin to exist? What is involved necessarily in my continuing to exist? And what are the necessary and sufficient conditions of my ceasing to exist? So it's entirely a question about existence. And that's all or nothing. Now, probably the most influential view in the philosophical writing about personal identity over the past 50 years is the view of the Oxford philosopher Derek Parfit, who defended what he called a reductionist conception of personal identity, according to which whether or not I continue to exist is just a function of how much of my brain and body is preserved. That is, my continued existence just consists in the continued existence of certain mental states, perhaps grounded in my brain, perhaps not. So what Parfit said is that on this reductionist view, sometimes there's no answer to the question, will I continue to exist? So it can be genuinely indeterminate whether an individual continues to exist or does not continue to exist. There'll be clear cases of continued existence, clear cases of ceasing to exist, but between those, there's no sharp threshold between, at least in some types of case in which, for example, there's a loss of the elements of psychology and so on over a certain period of time. During that period of time, the question, does this person continue to exist, may actually have no answer. It's just genuinely indeterminate. Now, if identity were a matter of degree rather than all or nothing, then the answer might be, oh, that person partially exists, but not fully. But the notion of partial existence is a difficult one metaphysically. So Parfit thought we should accept that our concept of identity, which is the concept of numerical identity, one and the same thing, is an all or nothing concept. That doesn't mean that it's always true that I either exist or I don't exist. There can be these gray area cases in which we don't know the answer because perhaps there is no answer. But it's still all or nothing. Now, I can go on to explain something else. It's something else that Parfit said that's extremely important.
Sure.
And that is it okay? Shall I go on?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Throughout, I think, all of human history, people have thought correctly that it's appropriate for me to feel a certain type of concern for myself in the future that I can't feel for anyone else. That is, if I know that I'm going to suffer agony tomorrow, and I also know that my child is going to suffer agony tomorrow, I may care much more about my child's suffering agony, but I can't anticipate my child's agony in the same way that I anticipate my own. And so what people have thought is that identity, personal identity, is the rational basis of this particular type of concern, which I call egoistic concern. Parfit called it what matters. He thought people have traditionally thought identity is what matters, that someone in the future will be me is what makes it appropriate for me to care in a certain way about that person. What Parfit argued is that identity is not what matters. Identity is not the basis of egoistic concern, or the rational basis of egoistic concern. And his main argument for that was just a simple thought experiment. We know that a person can survive with only one cerebral hemisphere. That happens sometimes. A person's one whole hemisphere dies, the person remains conscious, there's lots of loss, but still there's somebody there, and we think that's the same person. But the person could have survived with the other hemisphere. We can survive with one hemisphere, or we can survive with the other. We don't need them both. There's a lot of loss if we lose one or the other, but we can survive the loss of a hemisphere. But suppose neuroscientists were to sever the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres and extract the hemispheres from the brainstem and transplant one hemisphere into the body of one of my identical triplets, transplant the other hemisphere into the body of my other identical triplet, assuming that their hemispheres are gone, but they have functional brain stems, then those hemispheres, my cerebral hemispheres, could be functional in separate bodies. There would be two bodies in the room. These people could talk to each other. Each one of them would believe that he was me. Each one of them would say that he's me, and so on. And what's important on Parfit's view is that I, before this division of my brain, would be psychologically continuous with both of these people. And according to Parfit, and I agree, before the transplantation procedure, it would be rational for me to be egoistically concerned about both of these people. But according to Parfit and most other philosophers, I, before the transplant operation, can't possibly be identical with both of them, because they are two distinct, separate individuals. And I can't be numerically identical with two different things. It's simple. If I'm A and one of those is B and one of them is C, then if I'm identical with A and I'm identical with B, if I'm A and I'm identical with B and I'm identical with C, that implies that B and C are identical, but they're clearly not. They're two different people.
Yeah.
As Parfit said, they could have a duel and fight each other. So what Parfit said, and I agree, is this kind of example shows that identity is not the basis of rational, egoistic concern about the future. Rather, certain relations, on his view, psychological relations, are the basis of egoistic concern. This is really relevant to your project because on Parfit's official view, which he articulated in his book in 1994, is that both the criterion of identity, of personal identity, is a technical notion that he called psychological continuity. I won't try to explain what that is, but it's basically the holding of certain types of psychological relations over time. And he said that in a different relation that he defined as psychological connectedness, those two things together, psychological continuity and connectedness, are what matters.
Mm-hmm.
That is, that they are the basis of egoistic concern about the future, not identity. Though the criterion of identity is psychological continuity.
Yeah.
But you could have psychological continuity and connectedness without identity, as in the case of the division of the brain and separate transplantation of the hemisphere.
Right. Yeah.
The important thing here then is this. Everyone used to think that identity is what matters. Identity is all or nothing. So people used to think what matters is all or nothing, or the basis for rational egoistic concern about the future is all or nothing. If somebody will be me, I should feel fully egoistically or prudentially concerned about that person, whatever else is true, because it's me. Parfit says, no, that's a mistake. Identity is not what matters. The rational basis for egoistic concern is this set of relations, psychological connections over time, and that's a matter of degree. Mm-hmm. So what Parfit said was, it's rational for me to care about somebody who will be me in the future, much less than people in the past have thought, if I'm going to be only weakly psychologically connected with that person.
Right. Yeah.
And as in the case of the separation and double transplantation of the hemispheres, it can be rational for me to be egoistically concerned about people who are not me. So identity remains important in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really important, according to Parfit, are these relations.
Right.
Now, again, a thing that's extremely important to your ambitions or what you're concerned with is this. On Parfit's official view, let me turn off email so that won't happen again. On Parfit's official view, psychological continuity and connectedness are just relations between mental states at one time and another time.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought that many people think, well, these mental states, a mental state at one time and another mental state at another time, need to be causally connected in order for them to constitute a genuine psychological connection.
Mm-hmm.
In his book, he said, well, any cause will do. I later had discussions with him and got him to admit that he really believes that causation doesn't matter at all. So what that means is, so on Parfit's official view in 1984, a psychological connection really consisted only in something like this: qualitative similarity between a mental state at one time and another mental state at another time. So he believed early on, and I think, again, we have to separate questions about identity and questions about egoistic concern. But let me just state this in terms of identity to begin with. What Parfit believed was that if I were to step into a scanning booth on Earth now, and that scanner were to scan my whole body and gather all the data about every molecule in my body and send that data to a replicating booth somewhere else. And that replicating booth produced a molecule for molecule replica of my body. Mm-hmm. And if the scanning machine just disintegrated my body at the same time that it took the scan, the replica that would be created somewhere else would be me. And everything that matters in my survival would be present in the relation between me right before I have the scan and my body is disintegrated and the replica that's produced somewhere else. So that's like the Star Trek
Right. Yeah.
Stuff. What people call teletransportation or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Parfit called it that, teletransportation. Other philosophers, myself included, think that the process I've just described for you is one in which not only I would not survive, but also it's one in which what matters to me would not hold between myself before the scanning and the replica. So I would have no reason to be egoistically concerned about the replica. The replica wouldn't be me. And even though there would be a kind of psychological connection between me prior to the scanning and the replica, it's not of the right sort, because it doesn't have the right kind of causation. The right kind of causation is physical, functional, and organizational continuity of my brain. That, I think, is, for me, it's a condition of identity, but also a condition of rational egoistic concern.
Right.
So this difference between Parfit's original view and my view is, I think, what's really important for your project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing that I thought was really nice about your explanation just now is that it really makes this beautiful distinction between the concept of personal identity and the psychological continuity, because it really exposes personal identity as being nearly something like just a label that you attach to something, where it's very important that you can say this is an identity and there can be only one, and that is by definition a part of what identity means for this thing. And at that point it almost becomes irrelevant to the discussion about personal survival, if you wanted to put it that way.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Parfit tried to distinguish early on between something like continued existence and survival. So what he said was, identity is not what matters in survival. I think that's still misleading, because survival suggests that there is identity. If something survives, one and the same thing is present at an earlier time and a later time. And the important point that Parfit made is that that's not what matters. What matters is, if you're a reductionist about identity, what are the relations that are kind of constitutive of identity in the normal case? Those are what matter, and those are matters of degree. They're not all or nothing.
Right. Yep.
So the rationality of our caring about some person in the future in this particularly egoistic or prudential or self-interested way is not all or nothing. And I think that's very important for your project.
Yeah.
But what's also important is that there is this deep division between two groups of philosophers, basically. It's a division really about what matters, not a division about identity. And people who, like Parfit, or people who agree with Parfit, think what really matters is just the nature of the relation between some earlier mental states and some later mental states. And if they are qualitatively identical, then you've got the right kind of psychological connections, and this kind of egoistic concern is rationally justified. Other people think, no, it's not just a matter of how similar the earlier mental states are to the later mental states. It really matters whether the later mental states really are the continuers of the earlier mental states. And that requires the right kind of causation, namely physical and functional continuity of the areas of the brain that are involved in the generation of consciousness.
I would like to dive into that a little bit more, because I'd like to understand the difference of opinion that you have with Derek Parfit on this matter. It feels to me like that may end up getting back into our previous topic a little bit about what is consciousness and that sort of thing, but that doesn't matter. I would just love to understand where you differ from Derek Parfit.
Okay. Well, go back to his example of teletransportation.
Yeah.
Well, I could get in the scanning booth here, and there's a replicating booth somewhere else, maybe on Mars, and The scanner reads off all the information in my body, destroys my body in the process, but a perfect molecule-for-molecule replica is created on Mars. The replica on Mars is qualitatively identical to the way I was before the scanner destroyed my body. It's an absolutely perfect replica. The replica will believe that he is me. He will say that he's me. Has all, he'll remember all the things that I could remember, and so on. It's going to be exactly like me,
right.
Carbon copy, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
And Parfit thought everything that matters is present in the relation between me before I get into the scanning booth and the replica on Mars. Everything that matters is preserved. Doesn't matter whether the replica will be me. I mean, he said one thing we could do is, suppose they make two replicas, one on Mars and one on Venus.
Yeah.
They're two replicating booths. Well, now they're two people who are qualitatively identical with me. That's like, according to him, that's just like the case in which, or not quite, but it's relevantly like the case in which my hemispheres are separated and transplanted into different bodies. That's a case in which I cease to exist, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because everything that matters in survival, everything that is the basis of egoistic concern is preserved in my relation to both of these people. Right.
That's according to Derek Parfit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
so this is Parfit's view.
Yeah.
And my view is this is really counterintuitive to me. Here I am. I'm an embodied consciousness. What grounds my consciousness is the action of all this tissue in my brain operating in certain ways. A replica of that just is not me.
Right.
And I have no reason to care egoistically about a replica. When I get, on my view, when I get into the scanning booth and my body is completely disintegrated, that's it.
Yeah.
There's nothing,
So I'd like to dig into it a little bit more. Now, what if the replica wasn't created on Mars, but it was created in the next room, and it was using all of the same atoms and molecules that were used in the disintegration?
That's an interesting question. I always wondered, when I was a little kid and watching the old Star Trek, and the people would get into, what was it called,
the transporter, I guess, or the
transporter room.
Teleporter. Teleporter room.
Yeah, beam me down, Scotty.
Yeah.
And so when Scotty beams Captain Kirk down, what happens is you see all these little oscillating points of light, and then down on the planet below, or wherever it is that he's transported to, right before he appears, all these little oscillating, vibrating dots of light appear.
Right.
And I always wondered, are those Kirk's molecules? Are those Kirk's molecules being sent through space and then reassembled or not? And what I tend to think is, well, actually, if those really are all the molecules and they're simply disassembled and sent somewhere else and then reassembled very quickly, that is Kirk. That's the original Kirk, and everything that is the basis for rational egoistic concern is preserved in that case. But if those aren't Kirk's molecules, then he's not.
Okay, so there is a case where teleportation would, in a sense, satisfy your concern about survival, and there is a different scenario where it wouldn't. Now, what if, just for the sake of argument, the reconstruction contained 90% of your atoms and 10% from some other supply of atoms that we had?
That's very hard to think about. I just don't know. Now, because you're raising here a question about something that is a matter of degree.
Yes,
Suppose
exactly.
A neuroscientist were to take 10 neurons from my brain and replace them with perfect duplicates or replicas. Clearly, I would survive that. But I don't think I would survive the all-at-once replacement of my whole brain with a replica. So I can survive a certain amount of replacement. I can't survive a lot of replacement. And my view is that the basis for egoistic concern is preserved with a bit of replacement, but not with total replacement. The problem is,
even if that replacement were done, say, I'm really probing it because I want to try to understand whether it's more a matter of
Sure.
our intuitions potentially leading us astray versus a real issue where the intuition is correct and we have to accept that that is a real problem with the idea itself. So that's why I'm probing it that way. And so my next question obviously would be, all right, so if you're fine with, say, getting 1% of your neurons replaced and you would still survive, what if we replaced 100 of them, but not all at once, just do it, every day we replace a different percent? Are you ultimately still the same person?
Good. What I think about that is that gradual replacement of parts with functional overlap over time is compatible with both identity, that is my continued existence, and it's compatible with the preservation of the basis for egoistic concern about the future. So yes, I think all at once replacement, I don't survive, nothing that matters is preserved. Gradual replacement, provided that it is gradual enough so that there's functional overlap between the new parts and the pre-existing parts. They overlap in time and function together for a period. If that's the case, then that's compatible with both my continued existence and with the continued existence of the basis for egoistic concern. This is this kind of puzzle goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks.
Oh, of course, yes.
The paradox of Theseus.
This? No, this is extremely common. I mean, probably the most common view about this idea of mind uploading is that oh yes, we'll survive that if it's gradual, but you don't survive it if you make a copy, an instantaneous copy somewhere, or then you destroy the original, or whether you destroy the original or not often doesn't matter because the copy may not even know if the original was destroyed or not. But then, of course, this is where you start to wonder if gradual is okay. What does gradual really mean? What does functional overlap really mean? Because how fast can the gradual process go? Is it okay if we do this every day? There's 1% that gets replaced, or is it okay if it's every second? What if it's every millisecond? And if functional continuity matters, then what does this mean about people who are functionally discontinuous, such as someone where they are in the same brain, it is the same matter, but because they've fallen into an icy pond, all of the brain activity has ceased, so there's really no activity going on, and then an hour later they're revived on an operating table, and they're back. Is this the same person, or is this not the same person? Have they survived?
Let me say two things. First, three things. Your spectrum of possible cases in which the replacement is either very slow or very fast is a spectrum of cases in which at one end we want to say, or somebody like me with my views would say, yes, I continue to exist through this process of gradual replacement, and what matters in survival is preserved. If the replacement is much more rapid, if it takes place very, very quickly, so that there's very little functional overlap among the replacement parts and the original parts, then clearly I don't continue to exist and what matters is not present. And somewhere in the middle of there's just indeterminacy, just as there's, on Parfit's view, an area of indeterminacy about whether I continue to exist. So I would have the same view about this spectrum of cases. In the middle, there's just there's an area of indeterminacy about whether I would survive. Another thing I wanted to say was that when I spoke with Parfit about these matters some years ago, he's dead now, but I remember having conversations with him about this disagreement that we had. And his response was that I'm just not taking reductionism about personal identity seriously enough. If we're really reductionists, then the causal basis of psychological continuity shouldn't matter. This is an area of debate that I have always thought was extremely difficult to go deeper into. You yourself a moment ago said something like, well, we've got these intuitions. Are intuitions good guides, or are they leading us astray?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen arguments that go deeper and try to show either that our intuitions about these matters are leading us astray or that they really are reliable. It's very hard to think of good arguments in this disagreement that I and some other philosophers have with Parfit and those who agreed with him. Mm-hmm. There was one other thing I was going to say, but I forgot it.
Well, we probably will bump into it again, because I realize that it's very difficult to find good arguments or good thought experiments, or someday perhaps real experiments, empirical experiments, where you can somehow solve this problem. But just to understand better what you mean by somewhere in this space of possible rates of replacement, that somewhere there you get lost. This means that you have some notion of what you think a functional overlap is between an original part of your brain and a replacement part of your brain. So if there's a neural prosthesis that's being put in and it's created using exact duplicates of the neurons that are there, they operate exactly the same way, and you put them in, you replace the old one that way. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there isn't an issue of how you get that done. This just happens. What is the overlap that needs to occur? How do you define that overlapping that takes some time?
So much of this seems to depend on exactly how it is that consciousness works and what the capacity for consciousness in the brain consists in. Let me sketch two models here. This is something I've never written about and never even thought deeply about, but sometimes when I read in the literature about personal identity, or in some of the other literature, this question occurs to me. I actually brought to the interview here a passage in a book I've been reading by a neuroscientist, and it says, let me just read you this few sentences. Our magnificent pattern-matching brains do more and more filling in, not just because our senses require them to, but because they've had so many more experiences than young brains, he's talking about older people here, that it is simply more efficient to make inferences than to try to decode every little perceptual detail. Have you ever read a word and then found out a few moments later you read it wrong? You go back and look at the word, and you could have sworn you saw one word and now you see another. Yeah. Your pattern-matching brain simply made an error and sent a realistic, vivid representation of the wrong word up to your conscious awareness. Now, this is a neuroscientist who's saying there's some part of the brain that is our conscious awareness. There's this little module in there. That's where consciousness occurs. And what consciousness is doing is it's getting data from other areas in the brain where data is stored, and that those data are somehow brought into the little area where the spotlight of consciousness is shown upon them, and everything is taking place in this little conscious area. And I think that's probably not the way the brain works, but if it were, then what I would say is that little consciousness area, that's you. And everything else is just supplementary to that. And that's the little conscious area. That's me, and I'm gathering data out of different parts of my brain pulling up memories from here, beliefs from there, desires from another area, and so on. But it's all brought to this central processing area. But I think that's probably not the way consciousness works.
I can't even speak for the neuroscientist who wrote that paragraph. I wonder who it is, by the way.
Daniel Levitin.
Oh, Levitin. Okay. Well, anyway, I can't say whether or not he thinks that there is an area and that it is really upstream in that sense, or whether it's more a metaphorical upstream in the sense that there is something that we would consider higher just because it is closer to our awareness, to our momentary awareness of what's going on. But you're right, this does get down to questions about how does consciousness work, which is why I thought we were going to end up back in that territory as soon as we dive into these differences.
Consciousness is this somehow emergent from this dispersed some communication among neurons all over the place. If it's emergent from this very complicated process involving many regions of the brain all simultaneously and so on, then it's harder to assess the effect of, let's say, the replacement of a batch of neurons in one area of the brain with a prosthesis consisting of replicas of those neurons.
But let's pedal back just a tiny bit. Since you said that basically the sort of the functional continuity is important and the persistence of your consciousness in some sense, I'd like to understand a little bit more about that, because of course there are many times where we lose consciousness, right? And it could be that we just lose consciousness because we slip into another state of the mind, such as during sleep or under anesthesia, or it could be something more severe, like the example of the person who slipped under ice in a pond, and the hypothermia led to complete deactivation of all brain activity, but they were yet able to come back. And so the question is, if we think that we survive these changes in consciousness over time, then what does that say about the need for continuity? And if we imagine this process of replacing parts of the brain, and you were to do that at a certain rate, how does that fit into the notion of the rate has to be slow enough that somehow the consciousness that is emergent remains there or is still present in some sense? Because it isn't always present.
Well, I'm not sure I see the connection between these two issues, because what I think is that if the brain ceases to be active for a while, a person goes into a complete coma and is unconscious for a long time, or if a person slips under the ice and the brain freezes and everything is all the activity of the brain is stopped for a while, what seems to me to be true is that everything is still there. All the individual's beliefs, desires, character traits, all the person's mental states are
because
preserved.
It's stored in the matter, right? It's in the tissue.
It's stored in the matter, I mean, so everything is there. It's just inactive for a while.
Right. But let's say, what if we replaced all of the pieces that were there while it's inactive and then reactivated?
Then you would have ceased to exist, because I'm just telling you the intuition, the view.
Yeah, this is what I'm trying to get at.
For it to be the original consciousness, for it to be the same consciousness, it's got to the matter that is generating the consciousness in the first instance has to be preserved and generate consciousness in the further instances.
But you do allow for replacement of that matter while you're conscious, gradually.
Well, I think it doesn't matter whether there's a bit of replacement while the brain is inactive or whether there's a bit of replacement while the brain is active. That it is just that the replacement has to be gradual so that we can understand that after replacement, it's the same brain and the same consciousness. That won't be true if it's 98% replacement all at once. It will be true if it's 0.5% replacement at a time and the rate of replacement is slow enough.
But does it just become a matter of personal preferences then? Because maybe someone is okay with 20% per day.
No, it's not. It's not a matter of what we like or what we don't like. I don't think. But I mean, these are our intuitions about the persistence of entities. So what I was going to say is go back to Theseus's ship. If we have Theseus's ship, and what we do is over the course of a day, we take every board off the ship one at a time, but very rapidly.
Yeah.
And replace it with a new board. And we take all the original boards and we burn them. At the end of that day, do we still have Theseus's ship? Most of it say, no, it's entirely new wood. It's a new thing. Admittedly, there was a bit of functional overlap because the boards were replaced one by one, but they were replaced incredibly rapidly. Now take the original example of Theseus's ship. What happens is it sails across the Aegean, goes into port, one board is replaced, sails back across the Aegean, another board is replaced. And it goes back and forth over time, and after a year or two, something like that, all the boards have been replaced. There's enough kind of functional overlap over time that we don't see the replacement of parts as a threat to the.
To me, it sounds like when we're talking about it like that, as the ship of Theseus, and the problem of saying, is this the same ship, that we're no longer concerning ourselves with psychological continuity. That now we're talking about identity as a label again, and who is going to be satisfied with one plank replacement. So it's basically, most people will say it's the same ship if 90% is still the same. Some people might say it's the same ship if 50% is the same, and there might be a few extremists who say it's the same ship if 1% of the ship is still the same planks. But that becomes an argument about when you apply the label of identity again, rather than about psychological continuity.
Well, it is actually an argument about psychological continuity, because what we're thinking is these boards, these planks on the ship, these are the analogs of mental states. Mental states registered
mental
in the tissues of the brain.
Not mental pieces of tissue, but mental states.
No. Well, I'm making a simplifying assumption here that there's going to be an area in my brain where a certain memory is registered in certain tissues. I don't know enough about the science to be able to say what it is, but
that's fine. Yeah.
So let's suppose that there's a particular memory that I have left by an experience I had. So there's a memory trace there. There's some kind of representation registered in the tissue of my brain of an experience that I had in the past, and that's a kind of plank of Theseus's ship. Now, if you replace that one thing with a replica, that doesn't threaten.
Because it still gives you the memories, right? Those memories are still in the replica.
No. I think what's happening there is I don't actually have a genuine psychological connection. That there's no psychological connection between my original experience and this replica memory of it. It's not really. I mean, that's not really my memory of the experience. But it's one thing, so it doesn't matter very much. It's like a replacement. But it's still the memory. It is identical to the memory that you formed, right? So it represents the same result of experiences and how you filtered things, because someone read that out of your brain and built a replica that's exactly the same. So the fact that they used your brain, your blueprint, to create that makes it exactly your memory, because it was formed by everything that informed the creation of that memory. I'm not sure I understand how. I'm not understanding how
you can say that it isn't your memory because it's, it's foreign tissue, it's new tissue that's put in. And how does it become your memory if it wasn't your memory? This is very confusing to me.
Okay, you're going back to the fundamental difference that I have with Parfit.
Yeah.
Let's see. So let's take the notion of a psychological connection.
Yeah, it's the causality issue. Yeah.
Exactly. So Parfit says he defines a psychological connection by ostension. He says, here's some examples of psychological connections: an experience and a later memory of that experience.
Yeah.
Now, for Parfit, there is a psychological connection as long as the later mental state is a reasonably accurate representation of the original experience. It can be this replica.
Yeah.
Memory.
But there is a chain of causation to that replica too, right?
That's right. There would be a chain of causation, and for Parfit, that constitutes a psychological connection for his account of the basis of egoistic concern about the future. For me, that's not a psychological connection at all. Even though there's this causation, it's not the original. It's not the original tissues.
But is it really about the tissue for you? That it's not your tissue. It's the molecules were changed. That's the problem.
It's a replica, of the.
And yet you're okay with the gradual replacement, and there's some sort of process whereby it becomes a part of you if there's enough time, but we don't know exactly what that process is. There's no real definition of it having something to do with activity or non-activity, because losing your consciousness doesn't matter either. I'm just kind of confused about what the process is.
The interruptions of consciousness through coma or freezing or whatever, those don't seem to me to be problems. The question of gradual replacement of parts is one of the central questions here. Because you're pressing me to say, how is it that what matters is preserved when there's gradual replacement but not all at once replacement?
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, well, this is just the way we think about it's the way we think about identity. And my view
the label identity, right? So not the psychological continuity, but personal identity.
Well, it's the way we think about the identity of things generally, physical objects, minds, persons, whatever. We think that in general, entities can survive a very gradual replacement of parts, but not all at once replacement of parts. And my conception of what matters, or what the basis for rational egoistic concern is meant to, let me put it the other way around. Well, no, I can put it that way around. I seek to bring our account of identity and our understanding of the basis of egoistic concern as close together as possible. That gives me, I think, a much more plausible overall view. So, for example, on Parfit's view, the view that he argues for in his 1984 book, I didn't begin to exist until sometime after my physical organism was born. And I will cease to exist fairly soon into the process of progressive dementia. On my view, I began to exist as far back as we can trace consciousness in this body. And I will continue to exist as long as consciousness is present in this body, generated by this brain. Or I shouldn't say in this body, I should say as long as consciousness is being generated by one and the same brain. Now, what counts as one and the same brain? Well, it seems to me this brain will continue. All physical objects, including brains and bodies, we think, can survive very gradual replacement of constituent parts. That's just a fundamental intuition we have. We don't think they can survive all at once, replacement of all the parts. So the disintegration of my body in the scanning machine and the creation of the replica in the replicating booth, that's not me. It's also not preserving what matters.
Yeah. So just to make sure that I understood correctly, when you said that personal identity isn't what matters to survival, were you merely quoting Parfit, or is that also your opinion?
That's my view too. I mean, I think his example of the separation and separate transplantation of the two hemispheres in the brain is a sufficient argument for the conclusion that identity is not what matters. So I agree with him. Identity is not what matters. On my view, though, identity and what matters go very closely together, and they diverge primarily only in these science fiction cases like this case of brain division. Now, the big difference between Parfit and me is that I agree that you can have rational basis for egoistic concern about the future without identity in the case of double transplantation of the brain. I don't think that you have it in the case of teletransportation and their scanning and replication. Parfit thought those are exactly the same. I think they are fundamentally and deeply different. Why? Because the physical grounding of my consciousness and the persistence of my psychology is preserved in my relation to both of the people who will each have one of my hemispheres. It's not preserved at all in my relation to the replica.
Right. Okay.
So for me, the physical and functional continuities are essential. For Parfit, they don't matter at all. So here, let me just tell you this is just an anecdote. In his book, Parfit says what matters, what's the basis of rational egoistic concern, is psychological continuity and connectedness with the right kind of cause. And then he said, any cause is the right kind of cause. Doesn't matter if it's the replicating booth or whatever, any kind of cause. And I said to him at one point, this was a long time ago, but look, suppose that a nuclear bomb lands on my head here, and at precisely the same instant on the other side of the planet, a replicating booth is randomly programmed to create a human person, and that human person just happens to be a perfect molecule for molecule replica of me. There's no causation at all between my body and brain and the replica. And I said, so there's no causation, but surely you think that what matters is preserved there as well. It can't depend on whether there's some kind of causation when it doesn't matter what kind of causation it is. And my recollection is he said, yeah, that's right. So it doesn't matter even whether there's causation.
That's what I would have thought the answer would be.
So, there's the difference in a nutshell. I think it's got to be the right kind of cause, and the right kind of cause can't be any cause. It's got to be the normal cause, and he thought it could be any cause. So what that means is for Derek, the notion of a psychological connection is just reducible to a relation of qualitative similarity between an earlier mental state and a later mental state. That is what it is for there to be a psychological connection, which is the building block.
And a normal cause is the processes that are normally transpiring in a brain for thought to propagate and that sort of thing to happen, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
But then on top of that, I see the difference very clearly now, and that was perfect. That was a very good explanation of that. I am impressed to see. Sorry.
Say one thing quickly. Just one thing you need to know is this was a disagreement between me and Derek Parfit. And Derek Parfit is a lot smarter than I am, and he's a better philosopher than I am. But, I'm just sticking to my intuitions here. But, in the past, whenever I disagreed with Parfit about something, I eventually came to be convinced that I was wrong and he was right. I still haven't been convinced here, but I don't have good arguments. And in a way, neither did he. As I said earlier, it's hard to go deeper and adjudicate between these deeply conflicting views.
Well, this is kind of what I was going to say, which is I really do see the distinction between your view and his, and that the type of causation matters. But that's why then I'm impressed to see that you don't mind if there's a little bit of artificial causation put in every once in a while until the whole thing is changed. That's all, that you're accepting some exceptions to the rule that all causation needs to be of a certain type. Gradual replacement is okay. All right. So maybe you're not entirely on the opposite side there with Parfit. You're kind of gradually moving in that direction as you increase the rate of replacement.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there, by the way, before we finish this conversation, is there anything that I haven't asked that you feel that the listeners should really know?
Not really. Sorry, because I'm just not sure what your listeners are interested in, and so on. I'm counting on you to articulate their concerns.
That's fine.
And put them to me. I see my role in this as just helping to explain some of the ideas that have been present in the writing and the philosophical literature about personal identity, which again is just the literature about what it is for us to continue to exist, what the conditions of our ceasing to exist are, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
But I think one of the, again, as I've said before, I think one of the most important contributions that Parfit made to philosophical thinking generally is to give these arguments for the idea that it's not personal identity that really matters, and that it's relations which are a matter of degree. And that's going to be important to what you're working on. And so I might, even on a view like mine, if there's going to be a certain amount of replacement of let's say the material in my brain with some kind of prosthetic material, it's a replica. I might think if it's a tiny little replacement, that doesn't matter very much. If it's a more significant replacement, it may be rational for me now to care less about the person who's going to wake up with the new neural prosthetic area. I might think, even though it will seem to that person waking up after the surgery or whatever that nothing has happened, or that some old memories have been restored or whatever it is. On my view, no, I may have reason to care less about what happens to that person because this isn't genuine psychological connection. It's something else.
Yeah.
It's replication.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic.
On the other hand, if it were true, as this passage I read you from this little book suggests, that somehow there was a little homunculus in my brain that was the conscious bit, and the conscious bit was just getting access to information from this prosthetic implant. Then I would say it's fine that the data comes from an implant rather than from the original tissue. The original tissue in that case isn't essential to the generation of consciousness. The generation of consciousness is in some central location in the brain, and that's really neat. But as I said, I don't think consciousness works that way. So.
Yeah, it sounds too much like the brain being a radio in touch with your soul, and then you can switch radios, and the soul is still there.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the soul sitting somewhere in the brain and gathering information. Yeah. And so it seems pretty implausible.
Mm. Okay, fantastic. This was an extremely useful and enlightening discussion. I think we finally have some clarity on how to treat identity as a binary thing, as a label, as the concept of something having an identity. And also your differences of opinion with Derek Parfit. I think this brought us quite far. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And it's not just a disagreement between me and Parfit.
Of course.
People
Yeah.
agree with Parfit,
many others.
people.
Yeah.
And there's a spectrum, a range of views across the literature, but I'm just giving you these sort of representative sample views. So I hope that helps your listeners understand better exactly what's at issue here in some of the really fundamental philosophical problems that one has to address to be able to evaluate the kinds of possibilities, the technological possibilities that you're considering and hoping to bring about.
I'm sure it will. Yeah. Thank you very much.